If you enjoy unusual stories, you've come to the right place.
October 22nd, 2001. East Hampton, New York. Inside one of the most luxurious mansions in the Hamptons, 52-year-old millionaire financier Ted Ammon was found dead. He hadn't been shot, he hadn't been stabbed, he had been beaten to death, his body discovered in the master bedroom, lying in a pool of blood. There were no signs of forced entry, the alarm system was intact, the killer hadn't broken in, they had walked right through the front door. The murder sent shockwaves through New York's wealthy elite. Ted Ammon wasn't just another rich man. He was a Wall Street success story, a partner at Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, one of the biggest private equity firms in the world, and a man worth hundreds of millions. But behind the glamorous facade of Hamptons parties and Manhattan penthouses, his personal life was collapsing. A bitter divorce, a volatile wife, and a new boyfriend with a violent past. This is the story of money, obsession, and betrayal, a story where greed and rage ended in murder. Chapter 1: The Rise of Ted Ammon. Ted Ammon was the picture of the American dream. Born in 1949, raised in Pennsylvania, he wasn't born into wealth, he earned it. After graduating from Bucknell University and then obtaining an MBA from American University, Ted entered the world of finance, a world where fortunes were made and destroyed every single day. By the late 1980s, Ted joined Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, better known as KKR. It was a powerhouse in leveraged buyouts. These were the same men behind the infamous RJR Nabisco deal, a takeover so massive, it became the subject of the bestseller Barbarians at the Gate. Ted Ammon thrived in this world. Colleagues described him as brilliant, sharp, and ruthless when he had to be. He knew how to spot opportunities, and he had the confidence to pull the trigger on multi-million-dollar deals. By the 1990s, he had amassed a personal fortune estimated at $100 million. But Ted wasn't just about numbers. He enjoyed the life his money could buy. Art, travel, homes in Manhattan and East Hampton. He lived the kind of life most people could only dream of, and when he met Generosa Rand, it seemed like the perfect match. Generosa was striking, beautiful, artistic, full of energy. She was also strong-willed, someone who knew exactly what she wanted. The two married in 1986, and together they became one of New York's power couples. For years, it seemed like a fairy tale. They threw lavish parties. They were admired in social circles. They even decided to expand their family by adopting twins from Ukraine, a boy and a girl, Gregory and Alexa. From the outside, it looked like the perfect life. But inside the marriage, it was chaos. Chapter 2: Cracks in the Marriage. On the surface, Ted and Generosa had it all. A sprawling mansion in East Hampton, a Manhattan townhouse, millions in art, jewelry, and investments, two beautiful children. But behind closed doors, their marriage was a battlefield. Generosa was known for her temper. Friends described her as volatile and difficult. Ted, for all his financial genius, wasn't prepared for the storm of emotions that defined his wife's personality. Arguments became a routine part of their relationship. It wasn't just shouting matches, there were accusations, betrayal, control. Generosa was fiercely possessive and increasingly paranoid. She believed Ted was cheating. She believed he was hiding money. Whether true or not, her suspicion poisoned the marriage. By the late 1990s, the couple was locked in a toxic cycle, one moment trying to keep up appearances at glamorous parties, the next tearing each other apart in private. Finally, in 2000, after nearly 14 years of marriage, Ted had enough. He filed for divorce. Chapter 3: The Divorce War. For most couples, divorce is painful. For the Ammons, it was war. And the battlefield, money. Ted's fortune was immense, tens of millions in property, investments worth far more. Generosa wanted it all, and she wasn't willing to compromise. Court documents revealed vicious fights over custody, over finances, over everything from houses to paintings. Lawyers on both sides dug in. Friends recalled how Generosa raged at the idea that Ted might move on with his life while she was cut out. Generosa wasn't just fighting for a settlement, she was fighting for control. And then into this chaos walked a new man. Chapter 4: Enter Daniel Pelosi. In 2001, Generosa began dating a man named Daniel Pelosi. To outsiders, it seemed like an odd match. Ted Ammon was Ivy League polished, a man of Wall Street. Daniel Pelosi was the opposite, a Long Island electrician with a criminal record, a history of reckless behavior, and a violent temper. But what Pelosi lacked in class, he made up for with charm, at least at first. Generosa was drawn to him. He moved into her Manhattan townhouse. He drove her expensive cars. He began living a lifestyle he could never have afforded on his own. To Ted, this was a nightmare. Not only was his estranged wife dragging their divorce through the mud, but she was also bringing an unpredictable, dangerous man into their children's lives. And Pelosi wasn't just along for the ride. He knew exactly what was at stake: Ted Ammon's fortune. Friends later recalled how Pelosi would openly talk about Ted's money, about the houses, about the millions. He had stepped into a world of unimaginable wealth and he wanted to keep it. The tension reached a breaking point in October 2001. Part 3. Chapter 5. The Night of the Murder. It was Sunday, October 22, 2001. Ted Ammon had spent the weekend at his East Hampton estate, a sprawling mansion on Middle Lane worth millions. Friends say he'd been in good spirits even as the divorce dragged on. He was planning his future, preparing to move forward. But Ted never got that chance. Sometime that night, someone entered his home. There were no broken windows, no forced doors. The alarm system hadn't been triggered. Whoever came in knew exactly how to get inside. What happened next was brutal. Ted Ammon was ambushed in his bedroom. The attacker didn't use a gun or a knife. Instead, Ted was beaten to death. His skull was fractured. His body bore multiple blunt force injuries. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing was stolen. This was personal. Chapter 6. The Shocking Discovery. The next day, when Ted failed to show up for a meeting, friends grew concerned. His body was discovered later that afternoon inside the mansion. The scene was horrifying. Ted lay lifeless in his bed, surrounded by blood. For a man worth nearly $100 million, a man with influence and power, to die in such a savage way, it stunned the community. East Hampton wasn't used to murder, especially not like this. The police knew immediately this wasn't random. This wasn't a drifter or a burglar. This was someone close. And all eyes turned to one person, Generosa Ammon. Chapter 7. Suspicion. Generosa didn't seem devastated. Within days of Ted's death, she moved into the East Hampton mansion, the very house where her estranged husband had just been killed. Not alone, either. She brought Daniel Pelosi with her. The sight of Generosa and Pelosi living in Ted's home so soon after his murder disgusted neighbors and raised immediate red flags for investigators. Why would a grieving widow install her boyfriend in her late husband's mansion, unless she already knew he wouldn't be coming back? Investigators quietly began digging. They learned about the toxic divorce, the bitter fights over millions, the new boyfriend with a criminal record, and they began to suspect. Could Ted Ammon's murder have been an inside job? Chapter 8. Early leads. At first, police had little to go on. No fingerprints, no forced entry, no witnesses. But there was a motive, a huge one. If Ted was dead before the divorce was finalized, Generosa stood to inherit an enormous fortune, and Pelosi, by extension, would gain access to it all. Rumors swirled. Some said Generosa had openly wished for Ted's death. Others claimed Pelosi bragged about taking care of problems. Still, proving it was another matter. For months, investigators gathered evidence, trying to piece together who had been inside Ted's home that fatal night. The story was far from over. Part 4. Chapter 9. The investigation begins. Detectives arrived at the East Hampton mansion and were confronted with a chilling scene. Ted Ammon had been bludgeoned to death in his own bedroom, the crime meticulously calculated to leave almost no physical evidence. There were no signs of forced entry. The alarm system had been disabled, something only someone familiar with the house could have done. Every detail pointed to a killer who knew Ted personally. Police quickly began compiling a list of suspects. Generosa Ammon, now living openly with Daniel Pelosi, immediately drew attention, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed evidence. Chapter 10. The First Breakthrough. Within weeks, police began piecing together a pattern. Witnesses came forward: construction workers, friends, and even acquaintances of Pelosi. One worker testified that Generosa had once offered $50,000 to have Ted taken care of. Others described Daniel bragging about committing acts of violence at Generosa's urging. Christopher Perino, an acquaintance of Pelosi, revealed something chilling. On the night of the murder, he had driven Pelosi to Ted's home. Daniel instructed him to wait in the car, then went inside alone. When he returned, he was covered in blood. Perino later recalled Daniel muttering, "I think he's dead." Even Daniel's father admitted that his son had once asked him how to dispose of evidence. Chapter 11: Building the Case. Despite the shocking testimonies, police faced a problem. There was no physical evidence linking Daniel to the murder. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing concrete. The case would rely heavily on witness statements and circumstantial evidence. Generosa Ammon herself became a subject of scrutiny. Known for her volatile personality, she had a history of obsession, paranoia, and jealousy. Prosecutors suspected she might have orchestrated the murder. But Generosa was sick, diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. By 2003, her health had deteriorated significantly. Investigators hoped she might cooperate, perhaps testify against Pelosi, but she refused. She maintained her belief that Daniel acted alone, even as her own life neared its end. Chapter 12: Generosa's Final Years. Generosa's last years were dramatic. She married Daniel Pelosi in January 2002, 3 months after Ted's death, but the marriage quickly soured. Pelosi's reckless spending and brash behavior horrified her. By mid-2003, she forced him to sign a postnuptial agreement, guaranteeing him only $2 million in exchange for waiving any future claims on her estate. She rewrote her will to ensure the bulk of her fortune would go to her children and their nanny, the appointed guardian for Gregory and Alexa. On May 20, 2003, Generosa Ammon passed away at her East Hampton home. She was 50 years old. Her death left the murder case in an unusual position. The prime witness against Pelosi was gone, leaving prosecutors to rely almost entirely on third-party testimony. Part 5. Chapter 13: The Trial Begins. In 2004, Daniel Pelosi was brought to trial for the murder of Ted Ammon. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the nation followed every detail. Pelosi admitted he had been at the East Hampton mansion the night of the killing, but he denied striking the fatal blows. Instead, he claimed Generosa had orchestrated the murder, attempting to shift blame onto the woman he had married. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. Witness after witness testified that Pelosi had boasted about the murder, admitting he killed Ted at Generosa's urging. His violent past, history of theft, and prior convictions reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as reckless and dangerous. Chapter 14: Witness Testimonies. The trial's most damning evidence came from people who knew Daniel personally. Construction workers testified about money offered to harm Ted. Acquaintances recalled Pelosi bragging about committing the murder himself. Even his own father admitted he had been approached about disposing of evidence. These testimonies created a narrative of planning, motive, and execution. The jury had to decide whether to believe the witnesses or the defendant's version of events. Chapter 15: Conviction. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On January 25, 2005, Daniel Pelosi was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Generosa Ammon had already passed away 2 years earlier, never formally charged. Her name remained intertwined with the murder, her motives debated endlessly by investigators and the public. Chapter 16: Aftermath and Legacy. Custody of Ted's children, Greg and Alexa, was awarded to Ted's sister, Sandra Williams. She promised to provide the stability their father would have wanted. Years later, Greg and Alexa, now adults, co-produced a documentary titled 59 Middle Lane, revisiting the house where their father was killed. They traced their roots back to Ukraine, explored the turbulent history of their parents, and confronted the chaos that had defined their childhood. Greg pursued a career in filmmaking, while Alexa maintained a more private life. Both speak of their father with warmth, describing him as kind, generous, and a steady anchor. Their memories of their mother are far more complex, a mix of admiration for her intelligence and charisma and recognition of the chaos she brought when Daniel Pelosi entered their lives. Despite everything, they carried forward Ted Ammon's legacy, building stability and resilience in the shadow of tragedy. Chapter 17: Reflection. The murder of Ted Ammon remains one of the most infamous true crime stories of Long Island. It's a tale of money, jealousy, betrayal, and greed, where ambition clashed with obsession, and the consequences were deadly. The story reminds us, even wealth and power cannot shield a person from the darkness lurking close to home. Ted's life was extraordinary, brilliant, successful, admired by many, and yet in the end it was those closest to him who brought destruction. Chapter 18: The Calm Before the Storm. It had been a seemingly calm autumn weekend at Ted Ammon's East Hampton mansion. The estate was pristine, manicured gardens stretching toward the horizon, the ocean breeze whispering through the trees. On the outside, the Ammon family appeared flawless. Ted had just returned from a business trip in New York, bringing with him charts, contracts, and investment plans. He had always been meticulous, checking every detail, preparing for every eventuality. But that weekend, there was something different in the air. Even the staff sensed it, a tension they couldn't quite put their finger on. Generosa, on the other hand, moved through the house with a quiet intensity. Friends later said she was unusually agitated, pacing from room to room, often stopping at the windows, staring out as if plotting her next move. The children, Greg and Alexa, were upstairs playing quietly. The mansion, despite its grandeur, held an undercurrent of unease, a storm brewing silently. Chapter 19: The Murder Night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate, Ted settled into his bedroom, reviewing documents. He was oblivious to the danger lurking just outside his door. Somewhere, Daniel Pelosi approached the house. Accounts later revealed he knew the layout intimately, entrances, exits, and even the placement of the security system. He moved with purpose. Inside, the confrontation was brutal. Ted had no time to defend himself. Blows rained down in rapid succession, each strike precise, lethal. Blood splattered across the expensive hardwood floors, leaving a scene of unimaginable horror. By the time Pelosi left, Ted Ammon's life had ended. The mansion was silent again, but the air had shifted forever. Chapter 20: The Shockwave. The next morning, the discovery sent shockwaves through Long Island. Friends, neighbors, and business associates were in disbelief. Ted Ammon, a man of towering success, wealth, and influence, had been murdered in his own home. Local media descended on East Hampton, cameras flashing, reporters shouting for statements. Generosa moved seamlessly into the center of it all, composed yet calculating. The press captured the image of the perfect family fractured, a loving father gone, children confused and scared, a wealthy widow living with her new husband just weeks after the murder. The story was impossible to ignore. Chapter 21: Investigating the Impossible. Detectives combed through the mansion, analyzing every inch of the crime scene. There were no forced entries, no fingerprints, no DNA. It was as if the killer vanished into the walls themselves. But they found motive: the bitter divorce, the massive fortune, Generosa's quick remarriage to Pelosi. Witness accounts began surfacing: the construction worker who heard the $50,000 offer, the friend who saw Daniel covered in blood, even casual remarks by acquaintances about Pelosi bragging. It became clear this was not a crime of passion alone. It was calculated, premeditated, and executed by someone with both motive and means. Chapter 22: The Children's Perspective. Greg and Alexa, only 9 years old at the time, would never forget that night. Though too young to fully understand, they sensed the tension, the absence of their father, and the sudden appearance of Daniel Pelosi in their home. Their mother's charm had once made them feel safe, but slowly, her unpredictability and the influence of Pelosi created a wedge between the children and their father's memory. Years later, in their documentary 59 Middle Lane, they would recount the fear, the confusion, and the sense of living in a house where love and danger coexisted. Chapter 23: The Trial Drama. The courtroom was a stage, every detail magnified. Pelosi claimed innocence, attempting to shift blame to Generosa, but witness after witness tore apart his story. Construction workers described discussions of payment for harm. Friends recalled Daniel's boasts about killing Ted. Family members recounted prior threats and violent tendencies. The jury was captivated, drawn into the story of wealth, betrayal, and murder. Every word, every pause added to the tension. After weeks of deliberation, the verdict was clear. Daniel Pelosi was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life. Justice, in the eyes of the law, had been served. Chapter 24: Legacy and Reflection. For Greg and Alexa, life continued. Custody by their aunt provided stability, but memories of that night and of their mother's erratic influence remained. In interviews, they described their father as a man of kindness, generosity, and brilliance. Their mother, a woman of beauty and ambition, had been a source of chaos, her decisions forever linked to tragedy. The story of Ted Ammon is more than a murder. It's a cautionary tale, a tale of wealth corrupted by jealousy, ambition twisted by obsession, and a family torn apart by greed. Even decades later, the mansion at 59 Middle Lane stands as a silent witness to a crime that shook the Hamptons, a reminder that even the richest, most powerful families are not immune to human darkness.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to see more stories.